Okay, let's kick off this panel discussion. Ashke, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. It has been raised several times already this morning that to implement the national determined contributions is going to require a lot of capital. And there is ambitious policy also at the European Union level, and I think it's clear from Volker's presentations and also from Tom van Eiland's presentation that to succeed on this, you need to involve private capital. At the same time, there is many that mean that there are barriers that prevent capital from flowing to green investments and also to green infrastructure. And one of the barriers would be, of course, political risk. And I think if you look at the current EU ETS price, the price of carbon in Europe, it's very low, even if the targets for 2030 are very ambitious. And that, in my opinion, also points to some kind of political uncertainty, where the investors clearly think that it's better to wait and see. So I wonder, can you comment on these things, how to reduce the political uncertainty?
Tom.
Okay. Yes, good question about the ETS indeed. We have a system at the moment where the supply is fixed, demand varies, and demand has gone down over the years. In part, it was due to the economic crisis. In part, it was due to the rollout of, I would say, a lot of technologies that have reduced emissions. The problem is we now have a large surplus in the system, and that causes right now that, well, whatever remaining demand can be met by that surplus, and therefore prices are very low. What we want to do to correct that is we have now agreed upon the introduction of a market stability reserve, but it only enters into force in 2019, and it will gradually absorb that surplus, and it will make the system, let's say, more adapted for the future with a supply that is in principle flexible and can adapt in the future. So I would say on the long term, the viability of the system is there, and I think that is the most important. The question is, yeah, should those people that might think that in 20 years' time they need the allowances buy them today? Apparently the finance department doesn't get convinced of that. But on the other hand, I would say, does the ETS have a function well, does it have a disincentive for certain types of investments? I think it still has. People will still look at a carbon price when making investment decisions. I think there are several oil and gas representatives here. They all these days, when they make investment decisions, include a carbon price, taking into account that the future may evolve, that prices might come back. And that's not unimportant. I mean, if the ETS has done something, it has brought carbon into the boardroom, and I think that's an achievement. But that the price today is not there where it should be to drive, and that is then the investment on the low carbon side, that's correct. And we hope that the market stability reserve will improve that situation.
Okay. Stephen Gabriel.
Hi, Steve Gabriel, University of Maryland. For the record, I didn't vote for Trump, by the way. I have a question for Teresa, which is about the flexible demand. We have a very interesting project we're working on now with demand response in the US. It's actually based in Texas. And so there's some early adopters who have their thermostats in their homes allowed to be adjusted to load shift, make things better on the demand side. And these are the early adopters. But, and there's some benefits, of course, for power companies not having to have very expensive investments, gas turbines and so on for peaking and what have you. But to make all these flexibility areas in demand more long-lasting, you need it to be economic. People have to see the economics of it, not just these early adopters. So my question is, what are the public or public and private incentive schemes to make these longer lasting, this flexibility in demand at the residential level I'm talking about? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, this is really an issue to match the production with demand and to make the consumers able to make their own choices. Of course, this is not a solved problem so far, but as I mentioned before, we need a lot of new rules in the market. We need to make the consumers able to contribute to the system and to be valued for that. And I think this may be one way to answer to the problem you so well put now. I would also like to try to tackle the first question. I think we have short-term measures and long-term measures. We don't have a unique solution, but we really need to think long-term in an evaluated way. And if we don't have a really good, nice ETS system, we need to have good infrastructures, and that will contribute to solve the problem of integrating any sources, and this will be for sure a good enable for the clean energy mechanisms.
So no one-size-fits-all solution, but integrated systems that could bring it together. Carolyn Fisher.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I have a question, I guess, for Tom about the compliance mechanisms for the Renewable Energy Directive. For the 2020 targets, there were member state-specific targets that each country had to meet, and the 2030 targets are a collective goal. So am I right in interpreting the mechanism as being kind of like the Paris Agreement pledge and review, that there are sort of notional pathways that countries should take, but they don't have specific targets, and the Commission in the end has reserves the right for some sort of more mandatory policies, but could you describe a little bit about what that compliance assurance mechanisms look like?
Yeah, it wasn't. Okay. No, the flavor of what you're saying is correct indeed. We have a system in place with national targets up to 2020. It's a technology that has evolved quite fast. We are not yet at full market viability for most of the technologies, but some, notably wind, is getting quite close in certain areas in Europe. There's the desire to let it play more as a regular part of the energy market and to see that transition happen over time. National targets still exist, but indeed they will have to come bottom up. Member states will have to come forward with, and that's why the planning is so important, plans well before 2020. If they don't add up to the necessary ambition level, we have points of review. An element there is that indeed the Commission can still take additional initiatives if necessary. Another element is, I think that's interesting, we have created or proposed to create a kind of European renewable fund where if you don't achieve your target domestically, you can contribute to that. But that can then invest in places in Europe where, well, let's say the renewables development is not yet fully up to scale and where there's still potential to basically make also best use of the fact that we have a large territory and that, well, there are different places where there's still more or less opportunities to invest in renewables. But it's correct that we don't have, after 2020, a binding national target system in place, which is top-down implemented on member states.
Teresa, do you have anything to add to that? Because you were talking about 2020, which, let's face it, is only around the corner.
Yes, I think, as Tom said, we don't have the targets, but the measures have to come bottom up, and the big question is that the governments being able to create, not to create incentives, to create the conditions so that bottom-up measures appear, and I think this will be a long-term action that will result in the contribute to the economic development of different countries, because this question of clean energy mechanisms is also a question of competitiveness and development. So that's what I think.
Thank you. Professor Mark O'Malley of Durham University.
Okay, thanks. So I actually want to answer Steve's question because I don't think it was answered correctly at all. I mean, this idea that somehow that consumer demand response has a huge value is not actually correct. If you look at most of the work, the reason it's not getting value is because it doesn't have much value. There seems to be, we seem to have a lot of people who speak about things that we just gloss over. So if we're not going to be truthful here, we talked about Mr. Trump. I don't want to talk about that man at all, if you don't mind. But, you know, we talk about the truth. The simple fact of the matter is the literature shows that demand side for the consumer has very little value to the system. It has some value, but very little. I'm not saying the rules are perfect, but they're close. So in fact, one of the reasons you don't get value out of it is because it doesn't have much value. I also want to ask, if I could, I thought we were going to have the minister up there for a question. Can we ask him a question?
He's coming for the panel after the break.
Okay, I'll wait for him.
Yeah. But let me ask you this then. If are you not going to take into consideration consumer perspectives and what consumers need?
The single most important thing that we have to take into consideration in this transition is the consumer. I'm an electrical engineer, and I believe we spend far too much money on research and engineering and far too little on the consumer.
So this sector needs to think more
About
like
the consumer.
retailers, more like retailers.
No,
the customer is king.
don't put words into my mouth. I simply said that the consumer is very important. But I'm not an expert in the consumer, but I will tell you that demand response from a consumer, from a physics point of view, it brings very little value.
But the consumer, of course, is also what we're talking about here in terms of education, in terms of getting the message out, that understanding, because they'll need to change the mindset as well as companies and industry changing their mindset as well. Frank O'Sullivan.
So this is actually slightly related to Mark's point, which I think is a very valid point. The minister this morning, in his remarks, said that we can't build this green transition, if you wish, on the basis of a red bottom line. And then Volker, in his presentation, showed us the very significant amount of capital that's going to have to be invested. And it's not a European issue, it's not a US issue either. It's invested in places like India and in China. And that investment is going to have to yield some sort of return for those that are going to invest that capital. And increasingly, I think it's becoming difficult to see where that value is going to come from. So I'm curious, just in terms of our panelists here, if they have any reflections on the European experience and whether or not there are learnings for our friends in India and China who will really make or break this overall issue in terms of how we can make this transition work from a practical point of view, from a point of view of at least unlocking some value, because they're not going to be able to rent transfer their way to a solution like we can in the United States to a certain extent, like is possible in Europe to perhaps a greater extent.
This is a question for both of you. So, Teresa, do you want to kick off?
May I?
Yeah.
Maybe then you have more political answer. What I know about the European policies and regarding research and innovation, we have the international dimension of Europe. And a lot of what's going on is about collaboration with other areas of the globe. And with this specific purpose, we are not alone. I would dare to say it appears that the United States are alone now, but we are not alone. We are in a world that is facing a transition. And if we want to achieve the goals of the 2050, the well below 2 degrees scenario, we have to put on board all other countries. And that's why we have common projects with other countries like Africa, India, and maybe also we have good collaborations with China, and China is going its own pathway. Even today on BBC, we see that the government is implementing a huge policy framework for the integration of electric vehicles. But yes, I think this way Europe is doing its own obligations.
On the capital question, but okay, to some extent, maybe Volker or other people could contribute. What I understand is that if you really look at the capital numbers, it's the NTNU sectors that have the biggest capital increase. It's the energy efficiency discussion you have. So it's the built environment, for instance, that sees a large increase. capital returns, if I understand, typically are quite okay, but it's people are, well, when they make the investment, they might have shorter time horizons than than the society would like them to have. So there I think it is a part and an element of, if I may, where you can help with regulation and information. I mean, I think that is, for instance, one of the things we try to do with eco-design and with standards to make the efficiencies upscale in these sectors. I think the other question that you have on capital is, of course, how you get capital return in industrial and energy sectors that work, for instance, in the electricity market. I think carbon price is an important role in making sure that your carbon investment or your low carbon investment can have a return over time. I do see in the electricity market that we have a changing environment. What we have proposed is to work more on flexibility, more on price variation, so that you can cope with periods of lower prices, but also allow the market to gain return at periods of high prices when, well, there is supply-demand imbalances. We do see the role for flexibility there. So to the extent that we can have consumers active in that, we do see the benefits of that. So I think that are parts of the answers.
And I think this is something we can come back to after our break as well. We'll bring in the Minister and Volker as well. I think we've just got time for one more. Reinhard Madlener.
Yes, thanks to Mark. We heard about the importance of the consumer. And as the head of an institute called Future Energy, Consumer Needs and Behavior, I could not underline that more than he did. On the other hand, we do a lot of research on optimal investment decision-making under uncertainty, more recently also on the optimal disinvestment under uncertainty. And I like the headline of Teresa on technology should shape policy. At least that sentence or caption made me think about it. I encounter a lot of discussions with engineers, hyped technologies, hyped business models, and so I encourage all of you to think about that caption, technology should shape policy, or should policy and society shape the technological pathways? I'm still not sure about the proper answer on that. But maybe for the two panelists, I would like to know what you think about whether optimal disinvestment modeling and better decision-making on disinvestments could accelerate the energy transition.
May I answer to your yes? I think that we have a lot of chances to make better choices. If you remind when I began my talk, maybe we policymakers went for a lot of subsidies that were not good for that time, and they were not made on good evaluation about the results of those subsidies. This is not bad. It was good for the deployment for renewable energy. It created some distortions in the market, but this is a lesson to learn. And I think that governments cannot take decisive policies, I think, any policies. They cannot take decisions without evaluating the results. I think the key message, the key lesson to learn is evaluate before deciding and monitorize to keep on track the decisions. We live in an uncertain world. A lot of things can influence the decision taken before. We do not have a silver bullet, but we have the capacity to monitorize what's going on. And that is the main message for governments.
So don't take decisions before evaluating the results. Tom, have you got a few quick remarks on that?
Yeah, to be honest, optimal disinvestment, I'm not totally sure what you mean by it. If it relates to stranded assets, I think we had the slide from Volker Europe in a way is less of risk because a lot of our assets in the associated sectors are relatively old. Certainly in the coal sector we have that issue. So it's rather of making the right decisions for the future. But nevertheless, what we do see is that transition is not always easy on the ground. And you do see some, well, basically those employed in those sectors, they have challenges. That relates to what we try to frame as reskilling, so getting these people back into the market force, back into the labor market to find well, a new job. It's one of the things we want to work more on. So if you ask me, the question is important, I would say yes. I mean, this transition and the associated effects, one of the initiatives which is part of the clean air package is exactly to work stronger on carbon-intensive regions in Europe and to see how we can help with that transition. But I don't think it replied your optimal disinvestment question as such, but okay.
Well, Teresa and Tom, we're going to have to leave this part of the panel discussion there for now. Everybody, we're going to take a short break. I think you've certainly earned your caffeine fix. It's been a fantastic morning so far, but do come back because after the break, we're going to have a panel discussion with a few people up on the stage and we can get stuck in. I know there are already some clashing of ideas and some heated comments as well. So let's have a bit more of that. I'll see you at 11:35. Thank you. Thank you.